I came to this topic, as many of you have, living through the internet revolution, growing up with it in some sense. Feeling the idealism, the optimism, the sense that everything has changed forever, that nothing will be the same, and so on. And I've always wondered whether this is simply something, that sense of optimism, the sense of change, is merely a phase, or whether it is sort of a permanent change in the way everything will be. In other words, whether the internet revolution, as we think of it, is simply something en route to a different kind of future, or whether it truly is a lasting change in how innovation works, how information is moved, and so forth. And what I've been interested in is the best way, to my mind, to understand this question is historical. And I've been struck by the fact, in the research for this book, that nearly every generation tends to think that it's in a special time, tends to think that it's in a period of revolution, tends to think that nothing will ever be the same again. I'm struck that in the 1920s, when the radio was being developed in America, people had the sense that the radio was going to liberate humanity, erase borders, get rid of any existing kind of structures of communications and so forth. I'm struck by the fact that film in the 1910s was in what you might call an early YouTube era, where there were, in the United States in 1914, almost 5,000 films made, which is much more than the number of films made today. Now, these are shorter films, different, but they were in its own age. I'm struck by the fact that there was a point when it was perfectly conceivable for anyone to to open their own telephone company, a rural telephone company. You know, build their own wires, start a telephone company. This was a normal kind of a startup in the 1890s, this is, again, the United States. So I'm struck with the fact that we have been, in some ways different, some ways similar, through many of these ways. And what you see when you look at these, hopefully this will work. Here's the, not all those arrows seem to have worked out. This is what you see, and this is what I'm going to, the basis for this half-hour talk, is going to be this cycle. When you look at the new media of the 20th century, and by that I mean the telephone, the radio, the film industry, later on cable, the internet, in some parts, they tend to go through these four phases of invention, a transition to a founding, a transition to this open, utopian, entrepreneurial period, and finally into a final state of consolidated empire. And the fundamental question in my book is whether, again, to rephrase it, the openness that we see today in the internet is a phase en route to something else, or whether we have somehow achieved a final state that will change everything. History suggests that it's a stage, but maybe things will be different this time around. All right, so let me get into the body of the talk by talking about some of the challenges or the turning points that you see at each of these phases. I'm interested in this period in particular, invention to founding, for a number of reasons. And let me talk about an important example. This is the fellow many of you will recognize, who is a great entrepreneur in the 1870s, ran what looked very much to be a doomed startup named after himself, the Bell Telephone Company. Bell is an example. The birth of the Bell Company is an example of the challenge that almost every invention faces, which is avoiding being consumed by the dominant and existing monopolist at the time. At the time, communication by wires in the United States was dominated. Now, talk about the United States here. It was dominated by this company, the Western Union Telegram, which was an aggressive, powerful, belligerent monopolist. Particularly, I think this is sort of a story in some of the dangers of an information monopolist, the Western Union monopoly. Very not shy about using its power to influence news, not shy, combined with the Associated Press in a monopoly to try and swing elections one way or another, and not shy at all in trying to take over the telephone market as soon as it realized it existed. And so this company headed by Bell, there's a name for this that I use, which is this period of an invention to founding is dominated by the question of the Chronos phenomenon. Chronos, as you'll probably know, is the second ruler of the universe in Greek mythology. It was foretold that he would be dethroned by his children, and so he ate them one by one. And it is usually the case that the ruling monopolists in an area will attempt to consume its technological children one way or another. And that was very close to being the fate of the Bell company. Very close to it. So the whole story of modern wire communications, in some sense, rested on the ability of Bell to survive a very early attack by Western Union. And I guess what I'm suggesting more generally is in this cycle, for this cycle of innovation to happen, it is important that companies be able to survive that very initial phase, that they make it out of the cradle at all. Probably the only reason, there's only two reasons Bell survived when you look. And, one is Bell had a very powerful patent, very well-written, well-executed patent that it allowed it to credibly sue Western Union. Second, that just by a coincidence, at the moment that Western Union was about to destroy Bell, they themselves came under attack from the fellow named Jay Gould, this robber baron, 19th century. So they got distracted and let Bell survive. He had started the phone system, and eventually Western Union was destroyed. Not destroyed, but became a small figure. And one of my contentions, and I'm not really new with this, but more with Schumpeter, is that when you see these arrows tend to involve not an easy transition, but something more akin to a death match. That is, frequently in the move from one phase to another, one or more companies are in a struggle that will lead to one living and another dying. And nowhere is that clearer than with Bell and Western Union. The sense that one of those companies was going to go on to be the dominant monopolist of the American wires, and the other one was going to end up, in some ways, a footnote to history. So that's the first phase and some of what's important about it. The next phase that's very interesting is this period where you move from the power of the founder of the industry into a period of openness and open entrepreneurialism, where anyone sort of gets their shot. That's frequently a difficult transition as well, for reasons I will explain. So this is another important person in American industrial history. His name is Thomas Edison, and he's known mostly for, I think, popularly known for the light bulb and things like this. But he was also, for the first 2 decades of its existence, the most powerful figure in the motion picture industry. He controlled and ran a patent pool with some of the other important companies in the American film, and I'll say the American film industry, which determined very precisely what the shape of film would be. He was a classic example of the powerful founder. Now, as the founder, he had a very strong idea of what film should be. Films were generally to be no longer than 10 minutes long. There were to be no credited actors because of the problem of celebrity. That is, the possibility that someone would gain an independent following and then demand more money.
Very wise.
What's that?
Very wise.
Yeah, this is the problem with celebrity. They generally discourage the casting of any star or interesting figures. In the beginning, they didn't necessarily have plots. Eventually, they began to have plots in film. the whole idea of feature films was very suspect. It was actually a European invention. So they had their rules, and the reason is there was a sort of a fixed cartel, so a very fixed idea of what film could be. And it wasn't an industry anyone could get into at this point, at the beginning. It was an industry where you had to deal with the founding, it was called the Edison Film Trust, ruled film. Now, there was this interesting fellow, Adolphus Zucker, who had the idea, and he was one of a number of people we'll introduce in a while. He wanted a different idea of what film should be in the United States. At this point, Europe had begun to innovate and was the center of the world film industry in France. And they began to make more complicated, longer films. They didn't have these rules, including this film, Queen Elizabeth, which starred Sarah Bernhardt, a very famous stage actress in the 19th century. So the trust... So he had an interest in introducing this film. This film was 40 minutes long, which the trust was completely outside of the rules. It had a major star involved. It was dealt with a plot and all kinds. So the trust had no interest in this film whatsoever. Zucker went in to meet with the film trust, and the quote was, and if I get it wrong, I'm sorry: "The time is not right for feature film, if it ever will be." No interest in this sorts of thing. What's interesting in this example, by the way, is if you're interested in issues of free speech, communications policy is always very close to speech. You have here a private cartel in the United States, based on their patent power, able to exercise a very powerful sensorial effect on film. I mean, not only was it just feature film, they also, anything that was vaguely controversial was not to be shown. Even vaguely controversial. And it was all done through their patent monopoly. So this is an interesting example of when intellectual property rights are usefully used by private industry to enforce a speech code. Something that's quite a blind spot, I think, in the speech literature. Anyway, Zucker joined this group of people. He resisted the trust. He played the thing without a license and therefore became an outlaw, a lawbreaker. And one of the many themes in the book is the role that lawbreaking has in the innovation cycle. Occasionally in these transitions, in many of these transitions, you have, when you see lawbreaking in an information industry, it means that something is going on. It means there's some sort of an industrial succession underway. Because almost inevitably, the law and entrepreneurism or innovation run into some kind of tension. So here you had these four men, Fox, Zucker, Warner. These are some of the great rebels of the 1910s who were, all of them interested in breaking the hold of the trust, willing to violate the patent laws. The Carl Laemmle, who's in the lower right corner, was sued 289 times in this period. He moved off to Cuba, I think, to try and avoid lawsuits. But all of these people were some of them moved to Southern California, Hollywood, trying to get away from some of the lawsuits. So all of these people were heavily involved in the law-breaking operation. Eventually, they found, these are the companies they founded eventually to have their. So so it's very frequently, as you see from these examples, they went on to found companies that became dominant in the film era. And I guess what the point of this transition is to understand that the cycle depends often on breaking the founder's hold over the initial technology. It doesn't happen, none of this, I'm a Schumpeterian, none of this happens in very calm, happy ways. They had to break the trust, bankrupt all those companies. You've never heard of Edison Film Company. I don't think none of the companies that were in the American Trust continued to make films. They were all defeated, destroyed. And these companies based in Southern California, we now call them Hollywood, took over the industry. And it was, again, based on that overturning of the power of the founder. Okay. This is, this is another example of, a third example of, a less violent example of some of what one of the transitions. Radio, for a long time, since its invention by Marconi, for a long time was conceived of only for point-to-point communications, two-way communications. Some of you who know the history of radio will know this. Its highest purpose was to save ships at sea or communicate. This is an example of a ship that wasn't saved, the Titanic. There's a famous story that the nearby ship, the guy was sleeping, or so got drunk or was sleeping, so they could have saved the Titanic. Anyway, point-to-point communication was what radio was all about. And the transition of radio from a two-way to an entertainment medium was largely a function of amateurs and their interest in experimenting with radio for entertainment or to chat among themselves. So there's this this phase, and I think one of the most open or idealistic phases in media or in communications technology to this day. I think that in some ways the closest precedent to what the internet was like is American radio in the 1920s. And here's Lee DeForest, who is the operator of the first real radio station, 1916. They had this is just one of the things he said. There was this idea that radio broadcasting, speaking by radio to large numbers of people, was really something fundamentally that was going to change the world, and it did change the world, and save, overcome social barriers, break down the walls between nations, usher in a new sort of era of peace and understanding between all people. And it was the origins of radio broadcasting, I suggested, were with these amateurs, were with hobbyists, were with people who are not normally very commercial. It began to get, radio became a more commercial medium. This is one of the ways it happened, in a demonstration of radio's power. In one of the most famous boxing matches of the 20th century, earlier 20th century, this fight between Dempsey and Carpentier, two famous boxers, one an American war deserter, the other a French war hero. The point of this is, here's everybody who wanted to hear, this is Times Square, this is everybody who wanted to know what was going on with the fight. And they used the sort of the symbol or the marker that radio was becoming a whole different type of medium, a whole different type of technology, was its use of the radio to allow people to hear this fight as it went on. You know how it's very typical in the United States that you have Super Bowl ads that announce the arrival of a new technology, like the Apple Macintosh in 1984. Here in 1920, we have radio broadcasting itself being announced by a sporting event. In other words, an advertisement for the medium itself. And that is one of the ways that this idea of broadcasting was introduced to the world. Okay. Now I want to talk, by the 1910, 1920s, the three major, I haven't had time to talk about all of them, but in the 1910s, in fact you could sort of point at 1914 as a date. Well, 1910s, 1920s. All three of the major new media of the early 20th century were in these phases of sort of open entrepreneurism, idealism, and each of them, in different ways, eventually moved to a consolidated imperial or monopolistic system as its final stage, each in different ways. And I'll explain how that happened. In the telephone system, you had a period in the United States from about 1894 till 1920 or so, in which, as I said earlier, anyone, this is the independents, could build a phone company. And in opposition to the Bell system, they rose, they called themselves dedicated to American industrial independence, an uprising of people, so on and so forth. They were, and what's interesting about them is they had a different idea of what the telephone should be. A little bit like the Hollywood people, in the sense Hollywood thought the movies should be feature films for the people. The telephone, the original Bell company had the idea The telephone was a luxury service, mostly for businesses or rich people. The independence of the idea was what it ended up being, sort of a mass utility for everyone, and a social technology, something people would just use to talk to their friends and so forth. This idea wasn't in the original Bell conception. However, this is one of probably the most important figure in at least American communications 20th century, is Theodore Vail, the founder of the Bell system, the real founder of the Bell system. Vail took on the independence, and with the backing of enormous amounts of money from the Morgan family, managed to turn what was an extremely competitive industry within 10 years into a consolidated empire. And his achievement of that, very quickly, within 10 years, shows how quickly these things can turn. He just methodically moved from one company to another and either bought them, destroyed them, ate them, did something to every single company until by the 1920s, about the time he died, there was almost nothing left, and it had been completely transformed to a single monopoly. So an industry that was in 1907 extremely competitive, a wide open field, had by 1920 become a consolidated empire, known now as the Bell system. And you see in the advertisement here, the Bell system is an idea. And Vail did this, and the way he achieved this is very appealing. He didn't go out there and announce, I'm a hungry man, I don't want to get it. He said, we need a better national phone system. We have too much chaos, too much waste, too many companies going bankrupt. Let me have my monopoly, and I will offer you the best telephone system in the world, and I will run it as a public trust. He went to government. The antitrust department was a little, competition department was a little suspicious of him. He said, regulate me. Regulate me. I want to be a common carrier. I would like to have my rates set. Go ahead. It would be like Microsoft in the 1990s turning to the Justice Department and say, take over our operating system. That's fine with us. Set our prices. Just let us have our monopoly. This is what Theodore Vail did, and we will run this company as a public trust. And so he designed this idea, or is the embodiment of the idea of the enlightened monopolist, which has this enormous appeal. And I will suggest has an appeal which, people look back on this and say, well, that was a different thinking. No, I think you look back then, you'll be like, there's a lot of appeal, this idea. So what I'm suggesting is there will always be an appeal to move away from the chaos and destructiveness and randomness of a competitive system towards a monopoly which offers security, safety, reliable products, no spam, no Nigerian bank schemes. This appeal remains, and I think can easily come back in this time. Let's see what happened to the radio system. So the radio, as I said, was wide open in America in the 1920s in particular. And all kinds of ideas of what radio could be came into existence. But the most powerful, and the one that ultimately dominated, is AT&T's idea of what radio should be. AT&T, everybody knows this. AT&T founded the first radio network in the United States, the National Broadcasting System, NBS. They developed the scheme where they were the first to use advertisements, real advertisements in radio, sponsored programs, the mixture of sort of entertainment that sells, that is becomes a dominant culture of broadcasting in the 20th century. Eventually, they took the national broadcasting, eventually they had some legal problems, were a little worried about antitrust. They sold the NBS, they changed one letter, it became this company, NBC. Not well known that the ideological origins of NBC are the AT&T system and Vail's idea of beneficent, enlightened monopoly. I may be running about out of time, so I'll finish. The most extreme places that radio were taken was in other countries like Germany, where the whole thing was centralized even further than AT&T into a single system for promoting the totalitarian state. And that was, again, on top of what was originally an open and somewhat idealistic medium, very quickly was turned into a tool of a fascist state. So everyone knows a little bit about that. So what I'm trying to suggest is that all three of these things, and this is a little bit about the future, all three of these idealistic, open, new technologies by the 1930s had in one way or another become dominated, consolidated information empires. And so the question that I began with and I'll return to is whether this is a natural, inevitable process or whether this is a question of choice. Let me finish by just describing where I think things will go in the world, particularly if you want to see where things are going now or through the future. I think the place to pay attention to right now is in this contest between the three leading platforms of our times: the mobile phone, the computer, and the television. These are the three, when you think about it, these are the three devices that are probably the most intimately used information tools in our present time. These are the three information devices that dominate today, and each of them bears a different ideology. The mobile phone, the mobile platforms are probably, at least especially in the United States, the closest to the AT&T ideology of controlling as much as you can vertically, from towers through long distance and so on and so forth, down to handsets. The television is obviously the domain of the ideas of broadcasting and of the media conglomerates and of film industries kind of merged together. And the internet and computer, which I haven't talked much about, only have limited time, carry this more radical tradition of openness and 1960s, 1970s, I guess open and open theory. So these three platforms are in contention right now in a slow struggle for the future. And I see it as an ideological struggle as well as an economic struggle, obviously commercial struggle. And you will know how the future is coming by what devices become the dominant devices and the degree to which they begin to resemble each other. Is a mobile phone going to become more like a computer? It already has. But is it going to fully adopt some of the culture and ideology that was put into the Apple II, that was put in the IBM PC, that is the internet on the mobile phone going to be the internet that is the internet? Or is it going to be modified? Is the television, the culture of the television, begin to take over the computer to some extent? Or is the computer going to disappear? Will the television itself become more like a computer, colonized by Apple or TiVo or other companies interested in kind of changing the culture of television? This is where you will see the future, and this is where I suggest we will find out whether the past of the information industries is also its future. Thank you very much.